Good afternoon. On behalf of the National Board of Communities and Schools, our national office staff, and the CIS National Network, I have the privilege of welcoming you to the 2021 Milliken Dialogues. This year, we are, of course, not able to convene this important discussion in person, but I'm pleased that we have an incredible virtual lineup of speakers and guests, including Congressman Bobby Scott, Chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor, Haley Corman of Bellwether Education Partners, and two of our esteemed national board members, Juan Sepulveda and Talitha Haley from the CIS. And joining us from CIS of Atlanta, Executive Director Frank Brown, along with one of his incredible site coordinators and a graduating student. All are joining us today to discuss the importance of re-engaging students in learning following a year marked by a pandemic, a disruption to education, and a racial reckoning in our country. Also this afternoon, we'll be releasing our annual Community Matters report, which takes a deep dive into these same issues, so that once the discussion ends here today, you'll be able to take that report back into your schools, to your communities, to continue the conversation. And we're going to invite Congressman Scott up into the virtual stage shortly to kick things off. But first, I'd like to take a moment or two to do a little bit of table setting. For so many of the young people we serve, it's been a year of just devastating loss. Lost loved ones, lost days in schools with teachers and friends, or lost economic stability. This has led to delayed dreams of graduation or going to college. In fact, many students have disengaged from school in order to support their families. It's been just quite a year. And when I stepped into the role of national president and CEO at the beginning of it all, I never could have predicted that it would have affected the very core of what we do at communities and schools, being inside schools to help students. At first, there was so much chaos and crisis, and there was so much that urgently needed to be done. We had to make sure students had our support. We had to make sure families didn't go hungry. We had to make sure our school communities stayed safe and that our staff did as well. That need for safety first meant that so many of our staff could not set foot in schools for months or even the entire year, and yet they continued their important work in new ways. Our national network connected with families on doorsteps and in stairwells, in the parking lots of food banks and shelters. They came armed with grocery bags, rent subsidy checks, household goods, connected devices, and even headphones to ensure focused learning. They were willing to go beyond the school walls to reach our students and families. That's been our motto and our call to action this past year, because we understood the students we serve were already on unequal footing before the shutdown of schools. Black and brown students and students from under-resourced communities were already disadvantaged within our education system. The pandemic just exacerbated that. They also were under the added social and emotional pressure as they witnessed the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others as they tried to make sense of a national demonstration, a protest for racial justice. And we saw early on that students were feeling disconnected and disengaged from learning, putting them at greater risk for dropping out of school entirely. And at one point, as our friends at Bellwether found, as many as 3 million students were unaccounted for, missing from online learning or in-person instruction. So what did that mean for communities and schools? It meant that we had to meet the moment and re-engage those 3 million students. We knew how to do it. We hit the streets and knocked on doors. We called, we texted, we emailed. We were on their social medias, checking their Instagram. But we realized getting them back in front of a computer monitor or into a physical classroom was not enough. There is a science and a methodology to re-engagement. That's why we partnered with some of the best in the business, the American Institute for Research, to develop a model of re-engagement, not only for our students, but for their families. And today, 1 year later, we've made incredible progress. More schools are open, more young people are in class, and more students are reporting improvements, not only in academics, but in their social, emotional, and mental well-being. But we are not out of the woods. This spring, our in-school staffers are trying to help students see beyond the challenges of the past year so that they can finish the school year strong and make it to the next grade or to graduation. We have a long journey ahead and we cannot go it alone. It's going to require a community of support to re-engage every student and to reimagine school as a place that ensures all students have the same opportunities for success, no matter their race, income, or zip code. And that community support will include nonprofit partners, businesses, faith-based organizations, and elected leaders. And so now it's my honor to welcome Congressman Bobby Scott to the Milliken Dialogues and Policy Summit. And let me start by telling you a little bit about the Congressman and his public service. Congressman Scott serves as the chairman of House Education on Education and Labor. In this capacity, he's advancing an agenda that improves equity in education, frees students from the burdens of crippling debt, protects and expands access to affordable health care, ensures workers have a safe workplace where they can earn a living wage free from discrimination, and guarantees seniors have a secure and dignified retirement. Congressman Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1993. Prior to his service in Congress, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates from 1978 to 1983 and in the Senate of Virginia from 1983 to 1993. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership and advocacy on educational equity, which has helped to ensure that the students most in need are supported during one of the most critical times in this country's history. Chairman Scott, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today.
Well, thank you, Rain. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to give a shout out to my friends and communities and schools in my district in Hampton Roads and in Richmond that I used to represent. They've done a tremendous job making sure all students get a decent education.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for acknowledging the great work happening in Virginia. And now we're getting to see a little bit of what happens in Virginia, hopefully get to affect education systems all across the country with our work at communities and schools. So I want to start really, Chairman, as the chair of the House of Committee on Education and Labor, you're responsible for several large pieces of legislation that impact families, especially families that live in low-income and middle-class communities. And you've also worked on key pieces of stimulus funds that supported education in the CARES Act, Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation, and more recently, the American Rescue Plan. The latest funding really pushes states and school districts to focus on summer learning, social emotional support, mental health, and integrated student supports. You have an audience here of education advocates, thought leaders, decision makers, and nonprofit leaders. Why was it important for the federal government to take such an unprecedented investment in education, focusing on these areas?
Well, we had a problem in education equity even before the pandemic. Nobody knows that better than communities and schools. The schools regrettably have regressed in integration to the point where they're as segregated now as they were in the 1960s. These achievement gaps are bad, and along comes the pandemic and just makes things worse. A lot of the students did not have computers, so they just didn't benefit at all from the distance learning. Some school districts didn't have the connectivity or the technology to make distance learning work. And so in some areas, the bad achievement gaps just got worse. And so all through the pandemic, we knew that there were things that had to be done. One of the things, the digital divide is a solvable problem. You just have to buy people computers. Make sure that all the students have a computer, 1-to-1. Each student has a device, not one for the household, but one for each student, so that if classes are going on at the same time, everybody can participate. And also, some don't have internet connections. You can have a computer, but if you're not connected to anything, you haven't done anything. So you have to make sure that all the students are connected. For low-income students, that's a huge barrier, but it's one that we can solve. And the money in the CARES Act, one of the first large COVID relief bills, and certainly in the American Rescue Plan, a huge COVID relief plan, gave the localities the money to deal with this. But it's essential that we deal with it, because the achievement gap would just get worse and worse. There are a lot of things you can do with money that you can't do without money. You can't reduce the class size. You can't have if you're going to have in-person instruction, you've got to have the PPE. You've got to have counselors in schools. You have to have nurses in schools. And there's just a lot. You have to have more buses because you have fewer students on a bus. There are a lot of expenses. One very important expense is ventilation. As you know, CDC says you can be in a restaurant outside but not inside, and that's because if you're inside, in a stuffy room, one sick person can infect everybody. If you have proper ventilation, then maybe people won't get infected. Same thing goes on in a classroom. If you have improper ventilation, one sick student can infect the whole class. And the sinister thing about this illness is that you don't know you have it when you begin being contagious. And so you have to make sure that you have the proper ventilation at a time when study showed last year that 40% of the school districts need to repair, replace the ventilation systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in more than half their schools. Well, obviously, that's not free, and I think the money's there so that all of the school districts can open appropriately and start dealing with the learning loss.
Congressman, thank you so much for really displaying the amount of intention that you were taking to learning from folks. It's obvious that you've spoken to a lot of educators. I was watching a call that you did a few months ago with the superintendents from your district, and I think what they're telling you is voicing a number of the things that you have talked about in that address, which is you're right. Sometimes you don't do more. You don't do more with less. You do less with less. And I think the rescue plan dollars and some of the funding that has come through has been just incredibly critical. So I was going to just kind of along those lines. We know that a lot of students, for a variety of reasons, are falling behind in learning, and they miss a year of school or more. And many are at risk of falling behind academically or not graduating from high school. In what ways are you hoping to see the ARP funds spent on catching students up on this missed learning opportunity?
Well, one of the things we did with the rescue plan was designated at least 20% has to be used for learning loss. Actually, the whole thing, everything ought to be used for learning loss, but by designating 20%, we guarantee that a plan will be developed specifically for learning loss so that we'll know exactly what's being done. We know there's a significant learning loss, particularly amongst low-income students. This organization doesn't have to be lectured on what summer slide means, that low-income students regress during the summer, where they've been summer sliding for over a year. If they can lose a month or two during the summer, well, they did that last summer, then they did that again last fall, and then they did that again last winter, and they're still sliding. Well, that's a lot of learning loss to make up. And we have made sure that the money is there to address learning loss. Now, the American Rescue Plan, all the plans have distributed the money essentially according to the Title I formula, which means that the money goes disproportionately to the low-income areas where it is most needed, where they need counselors and they need other things that a lot of these schools don't have. And if we just look at the first thing we need to do is, first of all, assess who's behind and by how much. Some of the schools may have done okay with distance learning, and others, not well at all. But we need to make sure we have identified who's behind and how much, and those who are way behind may need to be in smaller class sizes. They may need more counselors, assistant teachers, longer class days, education during the summer, maybe Saturday classes, afternoon enrichment programs. There's a lot that they need, and we need to make sure that they get it. And one of the things we did in the rescue plan is make sure that there's enough money to get the job done. Some of the school districts will have a significant portion of their budget matched. 50, maybe some may even have 100% of their budget coming in through the rescue plan. In low-income areas, thousands of dollars per student will not be an unusual allotment because it's being distributed according to the Title I formula, which aims money at low-income students and has plus-ups for concentrations of poverty. If you are in in areas of very concentrated poverty, you'll get a lot of money out of the rescue plan, and we expect you to do a lot with it. Assess who's behind and how much, and make sure they catch up. And that's why these catch-up plans are so important, and why it's important to have a plan that deals with all of the problems you've had. Now, these school districts could not have budgeted this money. Nobody knew there'd be a rescue plan. And so this money is there to be used, and communities and schools, I'm sure, will be given guidance to school districts on how they can effectively use the money to eliminate achievement gaps, to make sure the students who essentially lost a year of learning, low income, minorities, English as a second language, especially students with disabilities. We had a separate 3 million specifically for them, but that's not going to be enough to deal with all of the problems that students with disabilities will be having. But we need to use these funds and make sure that we focus and catch up. That's really been the communities in schools mission all along. And finally, you've got the resources to be able to fulfill your mission.
Well, Chairman, it is just a breath of fresh air knowing that not only are you leading in Congress on this issue, but leading in this committee in thinking about what equity truly means, especially with something as specific as the kind of funding that we put out to support our schools and our educators and our teachers. I think to overuse a term that's been used a lot is what I think you've just described is how do we truly reimagine schools to support all students, and what we do to provide the kind of resources to those schools who may need a little more to ensure that we've got the counselors or the social workers or the communities and school psych coordinators focus on all those things that students need. That's the real vision of getting to see us learn from this. And it sort of brings me to a question that is a little bit about some of the work and some of the vision that you've had. And what we know has happened is that many students have disengaged from school. We've seen that in a number of different ways or a number of different research. Some students have had to work, for example, now that they're families, and see no reason to go back to school. But can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing to help students access career pathways while completing their education?
Well, we passed a couple of years ago the career and technical education to make sure that the technical education, what used to be called vocational education, is there, and those opportunities are there, and make sure that there's good coordination between the high school and community colleges, because a lot of we know that a substantial portion of the jobs of the future will require education past the high school level, not necessarily a 4-year college degree, but some education and training past the high school level. One of the things we passed already, it's over in the Senate, is the National Apprenticeship Act, to provide 1 million new opportunities, additional opportunities for apprenticeships. And we have drafted the legislation to encourage an expansion of the kinds of jobs that you can be in an apprenticeship for, not just the normal building trades, but also jobs in healthcare and technology and insurance and banking and things like that, that people ought to have that advantage. We also significantly fund the normal workforce training infrastructure that we have, the workforce, and we owe a Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Make sure those are fully funded so that people who access that structure will have opportunities. We're encouraging community colleges. I know in Virginia we have the short-term programs, and one of the things we're going to try to do is create what are called short-term Pell Grants. Right now, we have programs in Virginia where in 2, 3, 6 months you can get a job that'll increase your earning capacity 25, 50, even 100%. But many of these cost 2, 3, maybe as much as $5,000. Well, you've seen the reports that said that the average family can't come up with $400 if they had to, so that's out of range. You'd like to use a Pell Grant, but you can only use a Pell Grant if a college credit leads to a college degree. If all it leads to is a good job, can't use a Pell Grant. Well, that's ridiculous. If it leads to a good job, you ought to be able to use a Pell Grant. We have to be cautious as we open this door that we don't allow little storefronts to pop up and take everybody's money and deal out worthless credentials. If we limit it to referrals from the WIOA program, the Workforce Investment, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act boards, referrals, or community colleges, I think we can guarantee quality and not open it up to the abuse that we've seen in some of the college programs. But we need to make sure those investments are possible with Pell Grants. There are a lot of things that we can do, but we've already put in a lot of money into the process with the education. The president's infrastructure plan is a Jobs and Families Act. Jobs which will fund the creation of the jobs, the roads, the bridges, school construction, at least $100 billion in school construction to deal with problems of improper ventilation and the fact that schools are over 45 years old. School construction along with the roads, bridges, and housing, which would be very new for an infrastructure package. But also the next part would be the families part, would be funding the initiatives that make it possible for you to go to work. How are you going to go to work if you don't have daycare? Job training, all of the kinds of things that make it possible for people to go to work are in the families part. So the combination, I think, is an excellent initiative. It will move America forward. It's fiscally responsible. We repeal some, not all of the Trump tax cuts to pay for it. It's paid for within 15 years. And so I think the America would do well by if we can pass this plan, get the jobs created, get the school construction funded, but most of all, give young people the opportunity to go to work.
Well, Chairman, I think you've helped me just kind of get a good sense of not only where we've come from, because we've talked a lot about what we will need to get through the moment and this moment of the pandemic and the investments you're making, but also thinking about the future, especially around workforce and getting people back to work, getting Americans back to work, and also thinking about the beginnings of the pipeline of our students and ensuring they are able to take advantage of that. So, Chairman, thank you just so much for your leadership and for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with us at Communities in Schools. And one final question, the next session that we're going to have after this is going to include a graduating senior from Atlanta. I wonder if you have any words of advice that you'd like to share with that student.
Well, if he's graduating, our opportunity to invest in him are somewhat limited to this point for K through 12, but we're trying to improve the opportunities he'll have after that. One of the challenges we have is the fact that in order to get a college degree, you have to be willing to incur crushing debt. We're trying to allow people to go to college, get a 4-year degree without meaningful debt. If you're willing to work 15 hours a week, you should be able to work your way through college with no debt. If you're not willing to work, if you want to take a little more of a course load and not able to work, then maybe a modest debt. But people should not have to mortgage their future in order to get a 4-year degree. When I was in college, if you could go to college, if you could get in, you could afford to go, and you did not have to incur a crushing debt in order to go. Pell Grant covered about 80% of the cost of going to college. That's because the states were putting up about 2/3 of the cost of a state college. Now the states are putting up 1/3 or less, and the Pell Grant covers about 30%. Well, the rest is on the student, and that's just not fair. Particularly when we have enough money for tax cuts and a couple of rounds, 80% of the benefits going to the top 1% in corporations. That money should have gone to reducing the cost of colleges. That's one of the things that's on the agenda to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, is to make sure that this young man's college education can be affordable so that he could go to college, get out, and go on with his life with significantly more opportunities, but not held back by virtue of a crushing student loan debt. So we're helping. We're going to try to make loans less likely to be needed and easier to pay off if you have to incur some. So tell them we're trying to help, and hopefully the future is bright.
Well, Congressman, once again, thank you so much. What a leader to have in your position to chair the Education Committee, understanding what it will really look like for us to grapple with this question of fairness that you talked about and how we will be graded on this moment, but also into the future as we are all striving for a kind of justice, especially for those who have been historically overlooked or been discriminated against. What a time to be a leader, and we're just grateful that you've joined us here today. So thank you so much. And now at this moment, I'd like to turn it over to Talitha Haley, who is our moderator for the next panel.